questions Adam in Genesis chapter 3, verse 11. He says, "Have you eaten of the tree of which I told you not to eat?" Do you remember Adam's response? Genesis chapter 3, verse 12. Adam said, "The woman whom you gave to be with me, she gave me of the fruit and I ate." Notice how Adam is trying to shift the focus away from himself. First of all to Eve, the woman. But notice that he not only he doesn't stop there. He wants the focus to also be on God. The woman whom you, God, gave to be with me, she gave me of the fruit and I ate. So Adam doesn't simply stand up and say, "Yes, God, I disobeyed you. I'm going to own up. I'm going to accept responsibility." No, he tries to shift the focus away from himself to Eve. Well, God then turns to Eve. And Eve says, in verse 13 of Genesis 3, well, the serpent deceived me, and I ate. So she tries to take the focus off of herself and shift it toward the serpent. The devil made me do it, as Flip Wilson used to say. Well, that's what Eve's defense was. The devil made me do it. The serpent deceived me, and I ate. Well, what was God's response to that? God's response was to hold both Adam and Eve personally accountable for their own actions. They were reprimanded, each of them, and subsequently punished. God held them responsible. Adam was responsible for what he did. Eve was responsible for what she did. The serpent was responsible for what he did. We turn farther over in the Scriptures to the book of Exodus. And in the book of Exodus we find the account of Aaron and the golden calf. Moses, you might remember, had gone to the top of Mount Sinai to receive the law from God there. And he is in the process of receiving the law when the people who are down at the base of the mountain become very impatient. They essentially say, "Look, we don't know what's happened to this Moses. He's been up there for so long and hadn't come down. Why not make us gods that we can worship?" And so Aaron, receiving that request, Exodus 32 verse 1, then commands the people, "Bring all of your gold to me." And they do that. And he takes their gold and melts it down and uses it, fashions it into a calf, and then pronounces that this calf is Israel's God that brought them out of the land of Egypt. That's Exodus 32 verses 2 through 6. Well, God knows what's going on down at the base of the mountain, and so he tells Moses that he needs to go down and deal with this problem. And so Moses does, and when he gets to the base of the mountain and sees all of this going on, this worship and celebration of this golden calf, he questions Aaron about it, Exodus 32:21. He wants to know what all this means. What is all this about? What have you done? And Aaron's response, Exodus 32:22, is this: "You know the people. You know how they're just set on evil. You know the people." You see, Aaron, who formed this calf himself, tries to take the focus off of himself and what he did and put it on someone else, put it on the people. You know the people. You know how they are. And he said in verse 24 of Exodus 3, "I just asked for their gold, and I threw it in the fire, and then out hopped this golden calf." That's actually what he said. He's trying not to take personal responsibility for the work that he did. But his protests notwithstanding, God held him responsible, and he bore the responsibility for what he did. Then we turn a little farther in our Old Testaments and we come to 1 Samuel chapter 15. Here we have King Saul. And God comes to King Saul through the prophet Samuel and instructs him that it's time for the Amalekites to be punished for their transgressions, to be punished for their evil. And God is going to use the army of Israel as His tool to bring this punishment on the Amalekites. And so He tells King Saul in 1 Samuel chapter 15 to go and utterly destroy the Amalekites. 1 Samuel 15 verse 3. Utterly destroy them. And he gives them specific instructions. Do not keep anything alive. Not even among the beasts, the animals. Just completely and utterly wipe out that nation. Well, Saul goes out to obey God, and if you want to put a percentage on it, you could probably say Saul complied with about 98% of what God told him to do. He wiped out that nation. He did, however, keep alive the king, a man named Agag, and he also kept alive the choicest animals, the best of the animals of the Amalekites. And he did that, he'll later say, to sacrifice unto Jehovah God. So his motive was good. He wanted to offer sacrifice to God. But he didn't obey God. He didn't utterly destroy the Amalekites as God had instructed him to do. So Samuel comes to where Saul is and reveals Saul's sin. 1 Samuel 15 verse 14. When Samuel arrives, Saul says, I have performed the commandment of the Lord. Well, not really. And Samuel points that out. He says, if you've performed the commandment of the Lord, then why do I hear sheep? Why do I hear the bleating of the sheep and the lowing of the oxen? If you have performed the commandment of the Lord, why didn't you destroy all these animals like God told you to do? That's what God instructed you to do. Why haven't you done that? Saul's response, 1 Samuel 15:15. They have brought them up. The people spared of the flocks. Verse 21, the people took of the spoil. Saul said, don't look at me. People did this. They did that. Well, did God accept that? No. Samuel still said, 1 Samuel 15:23, you, talking to Saul, you have rejected the word of the Lord. Don't blame this on the people. Don't try to cast this responsibility on somebody else. You, Saul, were in charge and you did this. You made this decision. You bear that responsibility. God wasn't having any of this passing of the buck to someone else. But now I want to look at a different example. We've seen how people tried to pass the buck. I want to show you something refreshing from the Word of God. This comes in 2 Samuel chapters 11 and 12. Now the refreshing part is not the sin of David, though this text tells us of that. He sinned against God. He sinned against Uriah the Hittite. He sinned against and with Bathsheba. This is the case where David takes for himself the wife of another man. Bathsheba is the name of the wife. Uriah was her husband. And then he has Uriah killed to try to cover up his sin of adultery with Bathsheba. Terrible sin. Well, God sends Nathan the prophet to David to expose that sin. And Nathan does. Climaxed by Nathan's statement, you are the man. You're the man guilty of sin. But I want you to consider David's response in 2 Samuel chapter 12, verse 13. To Nathan's proclamation of David's guilt, David said, I have sinned. Isn't that refreshing? That someone would take personal responsibility for what they did. Isn't it refreshing that we don't read of David saying, well, you know what, if Bathsheba hadn't have been out there on her, at her place bathing where anybody could see her without clothes on, then none of this would have happened. You see, it's her fault for exposing herself the way she did.